What's up, guys? This is Nick from Arch City Poker, and in today's video, going to be continuing the Poker 101 series with today's topic covering how to play weak draws multi-way. So this topic was requested by Rudy, and I'm going to include weak flush draws and weak straight draws just because they play pretty similarly. But this is an interesting one because it's just so situational and so player dependent. There are spots where you should play these hands much more passively. There are spots where you should play them much more aggressively. And it really just depends on, your implied odds and your fold equity. And one thing I will say real quick is that you guys you'll find yourself in spots where you're like, hey, I keep finding myself in this tough spot post-flop. And you don't go back to pre-flop and maybe think, if I would have done something different pre-flop, maybe I wouldn't be in this tough spot. The difference between professionals and elite players and then just like recreational players or players that are a little more intermediate, I should say, is that pros and elite players think out hands, and they think out how their hand's going to play post flop, and they think to themselves, how can I put myself in a more profitable or like easier spot post flop, essentially. So I would usually suggest, as a default in your looser live low stakes games especially, is that when you guys go to 3-bet pre-flop, you usually do want to be a little more linear and have just nothing but like good strong hands, like obviously hands that are at the top of your range, and then hands like suited Broadway stuff and like stuff like jacks, tens, and nines, instead of just having just like aces, kings, and queens and like ace king. The point I'm getting at is that if you guys keep finding yourselves in tough spots post flop with hands like 9-8 suited, where you have a 9 high flush draw, or 6-5 suited, where you have the bottom end of like the open ender or something like that, you might want to consider 3-betting more often and adding these combos in your range. And things you want to keep in mind obviously when you go to consider this action is, who is the pre-flop raiser? If he has a really tight and narrow range, you don't want to be doing this because there's no fold equity. You often will get 4-bet off of any equity you have. Something else you want to keep in mind is your own image. If your image is very loose, then you probably don't want to just 3-bet hands like 6 high and 9 high, because it is not, you need to generate fold equity with these types of hands to make them profitable to play, essentially. So keep in mind image and who you're 3-betting, but I would say more often than not, especially the deeper stacks get in live low stakes games, you want to consider 3-betting those types of hands more often than not, because you will essentially make the SPR around something like the lower double digits, which is where these hands want the SPR to be. You put the player who, let's say it was the pre-flop raiser or just a cold caller who decides to call your 3-bet from out of position, and I stress being in position with these combos, you put them in really difficult spots. You generate a lot of fold equity. You make yourself a real pain in the ass to play against. It makes it to where you're not multi-way with a weak draw. And if you do flop some kind of weak draw, it's much stronger because of your implied odds, because of the fold equity that you've generated now by 3-betting pre-flop. But the reason that your implied odds are higher is because there's a much less chance of you being dominated by a better draw. Like if you're multi-way, your implied odds go down because the draw is more visible, especially if it's a flush draw. If it comes in, you're often not getting paid. Even if it does come in and you're the only one with that draw, and if you aren't the only one with that draw, then there is a great chance of there being reverse implied odds, and one of your opponents has the better draw, and you can get yourself in a really tough spot, a world of hurt, by drawing dead, essentially. So consider 3-betting more often with these types of combos pre-flop. I'm not saying to just do it blindly or every time you get these combos, but maybe start adding them in more often, and you'll start finding yourself in better spots post-flop and not in as many tough spots with these weaker draws multi-way. Now, let's say you do end up in a multi-way pot, like a single raise pot with a weaker draw with one of these speculative types of hands. Make sure that you guys, again, are not flatting too much pre-flop. And you want to be on the button. You really want position, because it's going to be hard to generate fold equity without the initiative often and without position. But I think that you guys don't want to overestimate your implied odds, like I said. And what I mean by this is that You could have reverse implied odds and be drawing dead potentially. That was already mentioned. Also, flushes are very visible. If a turn completing flush card comes in, players will often not pay you off. Now, if you have a player that you know will pay you off still with top pair or two pair type of hand, then you should be continuing. What I will say specifically is that let's say there's a pre-flop raiser, he c-bets, let's say there's two callers, and then let's say you have your 9-high flush draw and you decide to call on the flop. On the turn, if you make your flush, I don't suggest looking to get stacks in or like raising a bet on the turn. I think you should probably play small ball and keep the pot smaller. And yes, like don't fold unless you have a very good read that you in fact have like the second best flush somehow. So keep in mind like bet sizing, what type of player is driving the action. That will often tell you where you're at in the hand because many players on these very dynamic board textures will not be bluffing at a high enough frequency, not even close to high enough, which I always mention in my videos. So, I would say that if there's a pre-flop c-bet, or I'm sorry, a pre-flop raiser that c-bets on the flop, you get two callers, yes, you're going to have the immediate odds to continue with your weak draws. Just be careful about playing big pots with them because, like I said, the chance of domination is real if you have a weaker draw and it completes on the turn or river. So just keep that in mind. And I'm going to end it with saying that if you think you have fold equity with these weak draws in these single raise multi-way pots, play them aggressively. You can results that can often end up happening are you win the dead money on the flop if you can generate enough fold equity to fold out, 2 to 3 players. There could be a spot where the pre-flop raiser checks and the player sandwiched in between you guys leads for half pot. If you raise, you often can get the pre-flop raiser to fold a hand, say like a king high flush draw to where he's seen a bet and a raise now, and he thinks that he doesn't have the odds to continue, then that's a fantastic result for you. And maybe even the middle position player, he might call you there, but then he probably will be overfolding a lot of turns because his range could be essentially capped a little bit in a sense that he didn't 3-bet pre-flop. So on like 7-high board textures, his best hands are often just going to be like pocket pairs that are middling pocket pairs, like 8s, 9s, 10s. Even if he has jacks, if you guys are deeper, he's put in a really tough spot. And it's not the worst case scenario. If he calls, you have a backup plan. You have a decent draw that you can hit on the turn or river. So I think that you definitely want to think and consider if you have fold equity. That's very important. Obviously, the more players in the pot, the less fold equity there's going to be. I wouldn't start to try to play these weak draws aggressively with something like 4 to 6 players in the pot with you. That's going to be often a recipe for disaster. If you think that you have the immediate odds to call, then call and don't overfold because if you're going to play these hands, you're going to want to continue when you hit these draws. Just be mindful that you don't probably want to play for stacks a lot of times. You probably just want to fit this hand into like your, I guess like pot control, like a hand that you want to get the showdown, but you think you can win like a medium-sized pot with. And if there is 2 players in the pot with you, if it's like a 3-way pot, maybe 4-way at max, really try to think to yourself if you do have the fold equity. And if you can play this draw a little more aggressively, if you can get better draws to fold, if you can get better hands to fold, that's going to be a very important thing to consider. So if you guys have any questions or comments about this topic, let me know. I hope it wasn't too all over the place, but the concepts to keep in mind and to review are be careful of how much you're flatting pre-flop. Think to yourself, would I do better with a 3-bet? Would I do better just folding? Think to yourself post-flop, if you are in a single raise pot and it's multi-way with a weak draw, do I have the right immediate odds to continue? Do I have implied odds? Is there a chance of reverse implied odds that could really hurt my hand if I'm drawing here? Do I have fold equity? And do I want to play this hand aggressively because it lacks showdown value, because it lacks implied odds, and it does better as taking a more aggressive line? So if you guys have any comments or questions, like I said, let me know. Until next time, this is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care.